Okay, if we could grab everyone's attention. I know there's some people getting coffee and other drinks that probably trickle back in here. But we reached that point of our time together where there's a need for some closing remarks and some encouragement of how to think through all that we've heard and start that process, which will continue to be sure after the conference ends. And so we have a closing keynote speaker. And I should tell you that just like all of our speakers, throughout the entire conference and guests who were invited, there were reasons and intentions and purposes behind everybody who's here. And so we've been very thankful and thoughtful about this, thoughtful about the process and thankful that people were able to be here. But I need to concede that for this particular speaker, there's also a bit of nepotism involved, given that Richard Lerner is my academic grandfather, right? So he taught my advisor, Jonathan Tubman at Penn State, and to me. And so I say that to say that I grew up, in many ways, thinking about the ideas and scholarship of Richard Lerner. And so ideas of contextual embeddedness, history, temporality, plasticity, individual differences and diversity, those types of ideas that come up all throughout our conversation and presentations are ideas that I was sort of grappling with as I was learning some of this stuff from really early on. And so it's familiar and it's comfortable, but I think it also means that we need to think that we're constantly being reminded, I guess, of the need to embed our contributions and our ideas in other things. And we had that reminder, Carol, who had to leave, just reminded of us of that. We might see some data and think, well, that person has purpose. But that person lives in a context, and live in a city, live in a community, live in an environment. And to be mindful of what that means and how we're making our interpretation. And so, when I think about a closing keynote speaker for this particular conference, I literally cannot think of anyone better than having Richard Lerner join us. It's such an honor and a privilege that he's here to deliver this keynote. So let me read just a brief bio sketch of Richard Lerner, as if, again, we need it, but to do it right. Our keynote speaker, of course, is Dr. Richard M. Lerner, who is the Bergstrom Chair in Applied Developmental Science and the Director of the Institute for Applied Research in Youth Development at Tufts University. He was a 1980 and 81 fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences and is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Psychological Association, and the Association for Psychological Science. Dr. Lerner received his PhD in developmental psychology from the City University of New York. He is known for his theory of relations between lifespan, human development, and social change, and for his research about the relations between adolescents and their peers, families, schools, and communities. As illustrated by his 2004 book, Liberty, Thriving and Civic Engagement Among America's Youth, and his 2007 book, The Good Teen, Rescuing Adolescents from the Myth of the Storm and Stress Years. His writing integrates the study of public policies and community-based programs with the promotion of positive youth development and youth contributions to a civil society. Please welcome Richard Lerner.
Thank you. I'll try to keep you awake. I know after lunch it's going to be hard, but I'm also probably not going to take the full time allotted to me. But I started with 12 overheads, and I think I have 22. So I was asked by Jen Agins to think about how to put together some closing remarks that would both bring my ideas as well as the ideas of the group together around purpose and health across the lifespan, the theme of the focus of our conference. So unless we want to posit that there's a gene that integrates purpose and health and it acts irrevocably no matter what the epigenetic mixture of methylation and acetylation are, unless we want to make that claim, we have to deal with how does the relationship between purpose and health develop? And so I take that as my task, and I want to use what you'll see is called the relational developmental systems perspective. Relational developmental systems is a meta theory. It's a theory of theories. It's how you write theory in any domain. And relational developmental systems, RDS, is, I think, without question, the predominant meta theory currently in developmental science. So I want to begin by illustrating the challenge we have, and I'm going to use what is, not coincidentally, it just happens to be the case, the predominant representation of the relational developmental systems meta model to illustrate the case. And it was developed by some guy, Bronfenbrenner, I think, that some of you may have heard of. So here is a baby who is embodied in time and place in a complex micro, meso, macro, and exo system that is moving across time and place in a chronosystem. Our challenge is to figure out how little Zoe Kalina, this is the daughter of one of my colleagues in my lab, Christina Kalina, how she is going to become a person of character, a person who has purpose, a person who is thriving, flourishing across the lifespan. That's our challenge. And so to do that, to figure out how we can conceptualize the development of Zoe Kalina from, she was born with that head of hair, by the way. That's just a few days after birth. How we can get her from a few days after birth to a flourishing adult is the challenge we have in this conference. So we're going to talk about developmental science, and it's always good to begin with a definition. Developmental science seeks to describe, to explain, and to optimize changes within people, intra-individual change, and differences between people in how they change across the lifespan. This is a definition by Paul Baltus, who was the chair of Carol Riff's committee, Hayne Reese and John Nesselrode. The challenge right now is to understand that developmental science is in the midst of an all-encompassing paradigm shift. Up until the last 20 years or so, we were a field framed by Cartesian splits, nature versus nurture, continuity versus discontinuity, stability versus instability. Which side are you on? As the Nobel laureate Bob Dylan once said, everybody's shouting, which side are you on? But it was an integration. We've rejected these split conceptions that come from Cartesian thinking, which led to either reducing development to nature or to nurture by saying what was essential, what was foundational, a gene or an SR connection. That sort of thinking has been rejected, and we're now focusing in on what Bill Overton, who is, again, I think without doubt, the leading meta-theoretical thinker in the field, by a new process relational paradigm that integrates the sciences in a non-positivist, non-reductionist manner. And it leads, as I'll argue, to a meta-theory that promotes multidisciplinary approaches to understanding and, more important, to enhancing mutually influential relations between individuals' psychological and behavioral development and a rapidly changing bioecological world embodied within a culturally diverse world. Complex, but we have to figure poor Zoe's pathway. So what is this process relational paradigm? And I know this is not great to talk about it at any time, but certainly after lunch, so bear with me. So a process relational paradigm focuses first on process, systematic changes in the developmental system. It focuses on becoming, moving from potential to actuality. It doesn't focus on is, but always on becoming, emergence. It's a developmental process that has a past, present, and future, so time, temporality, is important. Holism. This is critical. The meaning of entities and events derive from the context in which they are embedded. You don't need anything outside of the system to explain the system. The system is self-constructing. And therefore, because it's the relations, the holistic relations in this system, you do a relational analysis. You need to assess mutually influential relations within the developmental system. You need multiple perspectives and multiple explanatory forms. You need different models. So within, this is a summary statement, within the process relational paradigm, the organism is seen as inherently active. You don't need something, again, from outside the system to activate the organism. Self-creating, autopoiesis, is critical here. Self-organizing, self-regulating, agency is going to be a big theme in my talk. Non-linear and complex, and adaptive. And this is Bill Overton, his 2015 chapter in the Handbook of Child Psych and Developmental Science, a volume that Bill Overton named, actually. Bill Damon named. I'm sorry, I look at him, I don't know, similar physiognomy.
I was channeling Bill Overton as he was speaking.
No, so actually, Bill Damon was the editor of 2 editions of the Handbook of Child Psych. And when we were turning it over to me to be the editor, to the younger generation, right? Yeah, I always defer to my elders. We needed a new name, and Bill came up with a name, the Handbook of Child Psych and Developmental Science. So Overton's chapters in that. So there's a lot of scholarship related to the emergence of this process relational paradigm. And I chose 2 from biology. As you'll see in a second, one reason being that Steve Cole is here. But I want to start with evolutionary biology. If you read one book in evolutionary biology, Jen Agins knows this. I think you bought the book almost immediately after I told you about it. Jablonka and Lamb, that's not Michael Lamb. It's Marion Lamb. I don't think there's any relation. Evolution in 4 dimensions. And a quote from page 1 summarizes their whole view. Molecular biology has shown that many of the old assumptions about the genetic system, which is the basis of present-day neo-Darwinian theory, are incorrect. It has also shown that cells can transmit information to daughter cells through non-DNA epigenetic inheritance. This means that all organisms have at least 2 systems of heredity, a genetic and an epigenetic. In addition, many animals transmit information to others by behavioral means, which gives them a 3rd hereditary system. And Gilbert Gottlieb, the late comparative psychologist, called this behavioral neophenotypes. And we humans have a 4th because symbol-based inheritance, particularly language, plays a substantial role in our evolution. It is therefore quite wrong to think about heredity and evolution solely in terms of the genetic system. Epigenetic, behavioral, and symbolic inheritance also provide variation on which natural selection can act. Some of you are going to say, this sounds like Lamarck, and it is. The whole emphasis in epigenetics is now is Lamarck was right. And by the way, if you read Origin of Species, Darwin himself agreed with Lamarck. It was only the neo-Darwinists who said Lamarck made no sense. Another example, and I asked Steve's permission if I could use this, and he said I could, the sample case of epigenetics and social genomics. So a traditional pathway that we might see, does this, oh, it does work, okay. Gene expression affects transcription factors, messenger RNA, which changes cellular signal transduction, peripheral functioning, threat perception, and then social behavior. But the beauty of what Steve Cole has been doing with his colleagues is to show that it's a system where the arrows go both ways. So you have the social environment affecting CNS threat perception, and all the arrows move down to gene expression. And of course, that's his work on loneliness and changes in transcription. So although I wouldn't say that Eva Jablonka or Steve Cole are relational developmental systems people or are process relational paradigm people influenced by Bill Overton, what I do want to emphasize by these 2 examples is that the zeitgeist is very much focusing on these bidirectional arrows and the autopoietic nature of the human developmental system. So this leads us to the process relational paradigm, and I think by this point all of these you'll see will be easily derived. Whether or not you accept it is a separate thing, but you can see the derivation. It's derived from the process relational paradigm, and that means that all levels of organization within the ecology of human development, from biology and physiology through culture, the physical ecology, and history are integrated. Everything varies by time and place. That happens to be an essential notion of life course sociology that Glenn Elder has reminded us of. Within and across levels, development across life involves mutually influential individual context relations. You pointed that out, Todd, and you'll see that a lot of where I'm going echoes what you said today, especially when we get to idiography. Integrated, mutually influential individual context relations is the basic unit of analysis within human development. Mutually influential individual context relations are the very nature of adaptation, whether you read Darwin or anyone else. The issue is what drives that. And here in the relational developmental systems paradigm, it's the self-constructing nature of the system. So these are mutually influential, but mutually beneficial relations, where you are acting on a world to contribute to a world that is simultaneously and integratively acting on you to promote your well-being, is the nature of adaptive functioning. This is an idea that comes from Jochen Brandstatter, who is a German action theorist. I'll come back to his work in a little bit. But mutually beneficial individual context relations are called adaptive developmental regulations. That the rules governing development are that the organism is shaping or regulating, governing the actions of the context that are also regulating and shaping the action of the individual. Time, historical change, which can either be normative or non-normative, contributes to systematic intra-individual change, plasticity. So there's always change. Most of the changes in life are stochastic changes. Over 99% of all genetic changes are stochastic changes. But they're short-term, microseconds, and because they're random, there's no predictability of when they'll start and when they'll stop. It's the epigenetic changes which not only go from one generation to another, but can go to a third generation, we now have evidence for, that we see that we can have systematic change in the structure and function of the organism. That's plasticity. But because of plasticity, scientists and practitioners can be optimistic that we can find ways to apply developmental research to promote positive, healthy human development. An example, character virtues such as purpose can be promoted through enhancing or creating adaptive developmental regulations, mutually beneficial relations between a person and his or her world. The person part of these bidirectional relations is what we term in the process relational paradigm agency. Agency constitutes the person's contribution to these adaptive developmental regulations. And there are numerous theories that try to describe what these integration of actions look like. Jochen Brandstatter talks about, in a Piagetian type model, tenacious goal pursuit or flexible goal adjustment, and the inextricable bond between the two. Jutta Heckhausen, who is the daughter of Heinz Heckhausen, those of you who know his work, the integration of primary and secondary control, Baltus and Alexandra Freund, the selection optimization and compensation model. And it used to be that action theoretical models were called German action theory, but Catherine Rafe, who was a graduate student at Clark, and I think she was there when you were there, Bill. Did you know her?
Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant person. She uses organismic developmental theory, which is Heinz Werner, but also Cy Wapner and Bernie Kaplan. So purpose is a fundamental component of agentic processes. One acts with a purpose, with an orientation to contribute to the betterment of the world that is contributing to one's betterment, because of the synergy, the integration of the organism and context within the context of these adaptive developmental regulations. So it's a fundamental component of adaptation. So agency and thriving, or health, within the RDS-based ideas makes us understand that because of this integration, purpose is an instance of character virtue. The role of human agency proposed in the relational developmental system of not only individual context relations, but of a special instance of individual context relations, you and the other people in your life, the child and the parent, the person and their community, is consistent with the vision for thriving and healthy development found within the character education literature. So I've just picked up some quotes here. Darcia Narvaez of Notre Dame. The individual has agency in producing a life that is good for one to live within one's community. Again, underscoring that bidirectional relation. All approaches to moral character education recognize the importance of social interactions for students' moral growth. Nucci and Narvaez. Then Larry Nucci himself. Character involves conceptions of human welfare, justice, and rights, which are a function of inherent features of interpersonal relations. And Marvin Berkowitz, who is our leading person in the study of character education programs in the United States. Character involves a public system of universal concerns about human welfare, justice, and rights that all rational people would want others to adhere to. Although some presidential candidates don't adhere to that, all rational people would adhere to that. But I don't want to get political. So let's deconstruct RDS meta-theory for a moment or two. Adaptation involves individual context relations that must vary across time or change and place. Then, in order to meet the demands that we meet, there are challenges in trying to function adaptively in a changing context that differs across the places you are. RDS meta-theory, therefore, promotes a notion of adaptive, positive, or healthy development that involves coherence of functioning across time and place and not consistency across time and place. Harkening back to Aristotle, we need to do the right thing at the right time and the right place. If we focus on consistency of purpose, we may be missing the point that we need to have multiple domains of purpose that we might need to marshal at different times. Your example of your purposes, I would like to make my example. I have not undergone the challenges you had, but as I think Jen Agins would say, I try to treat my graduate students like my own children. With one exception, I don't buy them cars. Which I did for my children. I said, Jen, that's the limit. Sorry.
I'm not buying Eric a car either.
Okay. So, from an RDS perspective, traits then are a myth. And I would urge us to be very careful when we use the word trait. This is a little sidebar, a little recommendation from someone who has rallied the troops in his lab for years against genetic reductionist theories. If you read Costa and McCrae, they argue that traits, the big five, are based in genes and are entities which are unavailable to environmental influence. I wish, Steve Cole said to me as he was leaving yesterday, he said, why do people think that? What aspect of human behavior is adaptive and doesn't change to meet the different presses of time and place? Of course, when you have huge stability coefficients of 0.3, which is the highest you've ever seen in any study of the Big Five, well, that 9% of the variance that they account for is so impressive. So it's hard to overcome that. But I was being sarcastic. Okay. You want to be careful when you use trait. It's okay to use it if that's your theoretical model. I'm not saying you can't have a theoretical model like that. But when we say we want to promote the trait of purpose, we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot. Okay. Now, because we need to adapt to time and place, and if we accept the idea of coherence, we have to have a non-ergodic approach to character development. Now, I'm going to explain what that means, but it means idiography. So, some of you may know the work of in my view, these are the two most brilliant developmental methodologists that we've ever had in the world. Peter Molinar, who was at Amsterdam, he's now at Penn State. John Nesserode, who was at Penn State and is now at Virginia, have explained why developmental science is not an ergodic field. I'm not a mathematician, so I'm about to tell you everything I know about the ergodic theorems. Okay? The ergodic theorems are theorems in mathematics that allow us to compute means and standard deviations. If we had a sample in which every entity was different and the differences were stochastic, what can we do with those data? You can't add up and divide by n. So the ergodic theorems are a set of theorems which say you can compute an average because everyone in your data set has two characteristics: homogeneity across the individuals in the sample and stationarity across time and place. The laws of the universe are uniform and permanent. Ergodic theorems allow us to calculate means and standard deviations and act as if the scores for the aggregate apply to every individual in that sample. Now, it could be the case that that's true, and I'll come back to that in a couple of slides. But you'll see it's very rarely the case. That was the Cattell stuff that I was talking about yesterday. So the ergodic theorem holds that the only time you can deal with the aggregate is if you have homogeneity and stationarity. However, variation exists across people within time and within people across time. In other words, people differ in their paths across life. As such, the assumptions of the ergodic theorems are rejected, and emphasis is placed on idiographic person-centered analysis, which, Todd, you made a great case for. So, and not as a developmentalist, see? So
Maybe now I'm one of you guys.
all right, well, you can join the club.
I have to learn how to say it first.
Right, I'll give you the secret handshake at the break. Right. If you read one new book this year, other than the recent book by Bill and Ann on character development, if you read one book other than that, read Todd Rose's book. Todd is a relatively young person at Graduate School of Ed at Harvard, and he is a protege of Kurt Fisher. Kurt, as some of you may know, became ill and had to retire, and Todd took over Kurt's center. He's been very influenced not only by Kurt, but by Peter Molinar. And he wrote this book called The End of Average. And it is a book, it's a trade book, so it's really easy to use, and his examples are great. And it explains very clearly why we need to get away from aggregating first and then worrying if there's individual differences. Because if you think about it, how do we figure error variance in ANOVA? All the differences within a cell go to error variance. And that's because we have the ANOVA is governed by the ergodic theorems. What he is saying is those inter-individual differences are systematic. He points out two concepts. How much time do I have? When am I supposed to end? I have 20 after 1. Okay, good. I'll get through. I'm already on slide 15. I only have a few more slides. So he introduces 3 ideas to help us explain why we need to focus on individuality first. Jaggedness. At any or all points of ontogenetic time, average scores for the variables that may characterize a sample do not reflect the set of scores for any individual in the sample. And individual scores will deviate above and below the average scores for variables. Let me give you the example that Todd, this is an example he took from the Air Force. Some of you heard me give it the other night. Right after World War II, the Air Force was testing its new jet fighters. And I'm presuming this was out in Colorado Springs by the Air Force Academy, but wherever it was, 50% of the test flights ended in crashes. And a high proportion of the people who went down with a plane died. And the Air Force was going nuts. They said, there's this great new machine, jet fighters, but we can't build them if 50% of the time they're going to crash and 25% of the time the pilots are going to die. Is the motors wrong? Is there something wrong with the fuel? Why are these crashes happening? Well, a colonel got the weird idea of actually talking to the surviving pilots, doing qualitative interviews with the surviving pilots. And they didn't have any idea, but they complained. They said, well, you know, I need a chair. I'm a short guy and I'm trying to fly the plane, but the pedals are down there. I have to stretch, right? Or I'm a tall guy, I gotta squeeze my legs in. Or you put that helmet on me, I couldn't get it over my head, so I couldn't hear the ground transportation. Or, yeah, I got it over my head. It went down so far, I was blind. I have to keep on pulling up the helmet because the helmet was too big. Or my arms were not long enough to reach that control. Or they were too short and I had to get out of the chair. So this colonel had no special training in aeronautics, in terms of jet design. He knew how to fly planes though. And he said to his bosses, maybe the cockpits are the problem. Maybe the cockpits are designed wrong. Well, the engineer said that couldn't be the case. We measured every physical attribute of every pilot, and we designed that cockpit to fit the average. They measured the circumference of the head, the length of the arms, the length of the feet, everything they measured, and they built the cockpit at average. But if you looked at that array, let's say 20 physical variables, no one pilot was average or fell close to the average on more than 3 out of the 20. They went back to the engineers. The engineers said, well, we can't design it. Do you want us to make a seat that can move up and back depending on the legs? We'd have to build some sort of lever to do that. Who could do that? Okay. So that's his opening example. And he goes example after example. The average doesn't represent anybody. So, but if we start with the aggregate, we're designing our world on the basis of something that none of us will ever fit. Context matters. The attributes that you see vary across place. The attributes of the person derive from these individual context relations. That's how they come about. Put people in different pathways. You're going to see them engage in different contexts. It will vary. And therefore, the trajectories of each of us will be different. We all walk the road less traveled. Human development pathways across life are fundamentally idiographic. They're not nomothetic. So now we need new approaches to methodology. People have been talking about measures all day. We need to have developmental measurement. So we all know about classical test theory. We need to put that aside and talk about developmental test theory. So we need person-centered analyses. Now, I'm going to explain P technique because it's going to be important in the next slide. Raymond Cattell was a great methodologist, and he designed a data box that allowed us to understand that any observation you make of anything in science involves a combination of three things. Some item for an entity, like a measure of purpose for a person at a particular time. So there's three dimensions to that matrix. The typical way we approach data analysis in the social behavioral sciences is what he arbitrarily called R analysis, which is how do variables go together across people within time. One of my big bugaboos as a journal editor has been that you have a longitudinal data set, multiple points in time, and at each point in time, the researcher does an R analysis. And I reject the paper saying, your question was a developmental paper, which is a question about intra-individual change, and you did an R analysis. All we know is how variables clustered at a given point in time, and you can't even connect that to the second point in time. So that's R analysis. Then there's a Q analysis, which says, and this is a quasi-person-centered analysis, how do people go together across variables within time? But there's a third way, there's actually more, but there's a third way of analyzing that three-dimensional matrix, and that's P, where you say, how do variables go together within a person across time? So instead of having 10 variables and 100 people to measure those 10 variables on at one point in time, you have 10 variables, one person, instead of one person time, and 100 points of observation. So you get an intra-individual factor analysis, which is an analysis of change. What's the structure of those variables across time? So you could also do a P-technique factor analysis by looking at theoretical divisions across those points in time and saying, let's say, for argument's sake, every 10 days is theoretically relevant. A dynamic factor analysis will allow you to make the structure you see at time 2 contingent on the structure at time 1, and the structure you see at time 3 contingent on the integrated structure at times 1 and 2. So time plays a role where in traditional factor analysis, even with P, it doesn't play a time. And then Nesser-Rode and Molinar developed an idiographic filter, which allows you to take the intra-individual change trajectories and then using latent variable analysis, cluster them at, if possible. It may not, there's no guarantee they'll cluster, but to see if there are second order commonalities, so you can move to a more nomothetic analysis. And then of course you could do third order, but there are other ways of doing idiographic analysis. Systems science methods, and I've listed a few here, are important. And Patty Mabry, who is at NIH and a student of John Nesser-Rode's, defines systems science methods that are designed to address complexity, change, nonlinear relationships, sound familiar, process relational paradigm, bidirectional relationships, time-delayed effects, like in dynamic factor analysis, emergent properties of the system, phenomena that are observed at the system level but cannot be linked to a specific individual component of the system. That's what system science methods are. And of course, we have another tool, and that is mixed method. One of the takeaway statements that I will leave this conference with, there are many, but one of them was by Ann Colby, when she looked at your quantitative data and then said, I don't believe it. I don't believe it because it didn't align with what I learned about the quality of the lives of these people when I interviewed them. And I would submit that she's right. And the reason she's right is we need to move your methods from the ergodic approach, here's what the means say, to a non-ergodic approach. And I'm hoping that we can talk about that. But mixed methods gives us a way of really capturing that dynamic between the quantitative and the qualitative. And years ago, Bill and Ann and Heather and Jen and I were privileged to have a grant from the Templeton Foundation to do a study of entrepreneurship. And we wanted to make it mixed method, but there was one limitation. I had no idea what qualitative research was. And Ann and Bill, I don't know if you remember, Jen, they came and they were so patient. They said, we are going to teach an old dog new tricks. And I owe them a great deal. I'm not saying I could pass a test that they would give, but at least I understand the language now. And I'm a big, it's sort of like the guy who used to smoke and now is against smoking. I used to just be completely quantitative, and now I'm, because of Bill and Ann's tutoring of me, so I'm grateful for that. So, conclusions and implications. How do we apply theory-based developmental science to enhance purpose and health development across the lifespan? Researchers need to study the interrelations of purpose and health through investigations that are based on RDS theoretical models. I gave the example of Bronfenbrenner, but there are a dozen different theoretical models that you could use. They all share the meta-characteristics, if you will, of an RDS model, in that they're focused on these mutually influential, mutually beneficial relations between person and context. That research needs to focus on individuals' agency. And here I learned about two approaches that might work. Wise experimental designs, which you may not, when you talked about that, I said, oh, that's putting the agency of the person, the opinion of the person in the design. You know, that's what we do in translational research when we're working with 4-H or other youth-serving organizations. We say to them, not here is our knowledge and here's how you should function, but tell us how together we can address an empirical problem of interest to you. So wise experimental designs are indeed wise. And more fundamentally, agency involves the person's, if you will, idiographic signature across time and place. And Joule rules. Joule is cool and it rules, and I can't wait to sign up for it and see how long I could stay with it. Because it is an exemplary case, and if we could get tools like that, we would be very fortunate to have that as a basis for the empirical inquiry in this field. We need longitudinal designs with at least 3 time points. I mean, that's the rule of thumb. If it's 2 time points, we get regression to the mean effects, and those effects decrease markedly with 3 times the measurement, but increase even more after that. And we need, therefore, intensive measurement designs wherever possible. One of the Achilles heels of developmental science is we divide, everything relates to time and place, but when it gets to the x-axis, time, we divide the x-axis on a matter of convenience or funding. Templeton says, here's money for a longitudinal study. You have 3 years to collect the data, analyze, and write the final report. So what do? You say, okay, we're going to get somebody right at the beginning, middle, and end of the school year because we need 3 points of time. But there's no rationale other than convenience for that. We need theoretically predicated divisions of the x-axis. And if we had them, we could use a technique called burst designs, which, I did a 4-H study of positive youth development. I had 7,000 people from 42 states. And it went from a grade 5 to grade 12. And it was like a $9 million grant, but we didn't have the money to go more than once a year. So because of economic necessities, we just divided it by year. What we could have done, however, now that people like Todd Little and other people have made advancements, we could have had some theoretical idea about important transition points. Like we know going from middle school or elementary to middle, or middle to high school are transition points. You do a burst design. You do a P technique with, let's say, a random sample of 50 kids every day before, 50 days before and 50 days after the transition. And then you can do missing data, multiple imputation to get to the larger sample. But these burst designs would be very valuable if we had some theory of the x-axis. We need to have change sensitivity of designs, measures, and analyses. In designs, and I said I would come back to it, we need P, not R or Q. You can't go from a study of how variables go together within time to an understanding of how variables are structured within a person across time unless P equals R. Unless you can establish that, and theoretically could happen, and I actually have a study published with John Nesser in which we established that for a data set. But it's very rare to see that. If you remember Todd Rose's idea about how few people are at the average. So we need designs that can get at intra-individual change. We need measures that avoid trait approaches. The evidence that Coster and McCrae use to establish the stability of personality across time came originally from the Guilford-Zimmerman personality inventory. J.P. Guilford was a colleague of Ray Cattell's at University of Illinois, and if anybody has ever used the Guilford-Zimmerman personality inventory? J.P. Guilford, another brilliant guy, his question was, what are the attributes of individuality that remain invariant across time and place? It's a legitimate question. And so what he did is he had thousands of items, and any item that showed variation across time and place, age or SES or whatever, he threw out. He only kept in the Guilford-Zimmerman personality inventory those items which showed no variation across time and place. And that was what made up the Guilford, and that's fine. So then Coster and McCrae said, we want to investigate whether personality stays the same across time and place. And guess what they chose? They chose the Guilford-Zimmerman. And I remember I was at a conference with Paul Costa once, and I said, Paul, what you've demonstrated is that a measure designed to show invariance, in fact, shows invariance, which is great because it's wonderful that in psychology we can get a measure to work the way we want it to. But you haven't tested the hypothesis. You need to have a measure that could show change. He didn't like that. I have not got a Christmas card from him since, but anyway, I get myself in trouble with my big mouth. But anyway, then we need analyses reflecting non-ergodicity. We need to analyze individuals before aggregating. It doesn't mean, the idiographic filter will get us from the individual, but we can't start at the aggregate anymore and think we're understanding human individuality. And critically, everything we do quantitatively should, if we can, triangulate with qualitative data. If it doesn't, we're going to have Anne, represented as that Jiminy Cricket on our shoulder, saying, it makes no sense. It has to converge. And she's entirely right. And one of the things that I'm an embarrassed Rich Bollinger, but one of the great things about Templeton is they agree with that, and they'll give you the money to triangulate across quantitative and qualitative. Where, as you know, some funding sources, NIH, may not do that. So we want to triangulate. When we do that, when we're comparing quantitative and qualitative, I was reminded by an old professor of Bill's, Jack Block, who's passed away, but he wrote a paper in 1996. I'm sorry, Todd, as I said, I stopped reading a while, so the only references I have are old ones. He talked about the jingle-jangle fallacy in studying human attributes. Jingle is when you have two different things that are the same because you label them the same. And jangle is you have identical things, but you give them a different label and you say, oh, they're different. And now look, they're correlated. Wow. So I think our challenge when we're moving from the quantitative to the qualitative is to keep that in mind, sort of like a filter. Are we jingling or jangling here? And so this is our challenge. The current president of the Society for Research in Child Development, Mark Bornstein, who has drunk the Kool-Aid and agrees with relational developmental systems, says our challenge as developmental scientists is to ask a complex question based on the specificity principle. If everything is going to vary across time and place, One of the things I learned is about domains of purpose. What specific attributes or domains of purpose for individuals of what ages and other races, religions, immigrant status, developing in what specific settings, rural, urban, international settings, poverty versus non-poverty settings, with what specific experiences, I gave an example from my own research, individuals participating or not in specific youth development or character education programs. So 4-H or Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, and linked to what other specific attributes of the individual. For example, hopeful future expectations is an important moderator variable of character and I would guess purpose. I don't know if there's a study of that. Intentional self-regulation, self-control variables, and ecological variables, culture, history, and especially non-normative events. Some of you may know that there's a place called the Aleppo. You may have heard of that, although some people have not. Can kids in Aleppo really develop purpose, given that they're starving and every day they have to worry if their government is going to bomb them with poison chemicals? So non-normative events and what purposes can parents inculcate in their African American sons at a time when walking on the street with Skittles gets you shot? These are historical events, non-normative events, although it's the season for shooting African American men seems to be, unarmed African American men seems to be more normative than non-normative. We need to understand that context. And then when we ask that, we have to say, how does all this result in what specific developmental trajectories of the development of purpose and of other theoretically specified features of human development, for example, purpose related to active and positive civic engagement, or effective parenting, or love of one's, of students and giving to your students as you would your own children, across what specific portions of a lifetime. If we could develop multivariate, multi-level, longitudinal research that answers these questions, we could help Zoe Kalina move from a thriving baby to a flourishing adult with purpose and contributions in her life. So, thank you. Can I sit down?
We have a few minutes if there are questions or reactions.
Yeah,
Sure.
1,000 questions, and thank you. That was just one of the most interesting, stimulating talks I've heard in a long time.
Thank you.
But two thoughts that came to mind, and because they've been coming to my mind a lot, and one is the epigenetic issue, that being in public health, we would always say X% of your health relates to genes, Y% relates to environment, another relates to behavior. And now, with epigenetics, I think that is completely wrong-headed to even think about these as static domains, that they really are literally all three interacting all the time. And that's what you bring up really nicely, and it makes it...
Well, it comes from Steve Cole, doesn't come from me, so...
Yeah, but that's really an important thing, that we stop thinking about these as silos, and we start thinking about them as really interacting, which changes a lot of things about how we think. The other, though, obviously, is this P technique, which I've already been looking up and downloading articles on because I really want to learn more about it. As I was building Joule, we were starting to realize that as we would identify a single item of presence, for example, or of creativity, that probably means so much, that's so different for you than for me. And I was so bothered by that because, and other people were too, why don't you have 30 items related to presence? Well, because I don't have to measure yoga in you if you don't engage in yoga ever. If you're a meditator, or if you walk in the park, or you pray for your presence, it's whether you are present or not individually. And as you're building precision medicine or precision well-being, we have to get used to the fact that means are meaningless.
Yes.
That 30 items are used to capture a mean in a population. That's why you need 30 items, to capture everybody's variance as well as you can. But if you're capturing one person going through time,
You measure
think
that
about
person,
that person's
presence in yoga, 30 days, 40 days, 50 days. There's your variance. It's intra-individual variance. It's meaningful for that person.
And then I guess you go up to the nomothetic and ask, okay, can you look at some kind of overall average? Can you start asking the question, does everybody's presence have some relationship, correlation with something else? Is that correct?
Yes. So
Okay, I was
that
trying
would
to
be the
figure that
Idiographic
out.
filter. And that, look, I'm no statistician, I'm certainly no mathematician, but the idea is pretty simple. You go from your observed patterns of covariation, which are, if you will, first order factor analysis, and then you say, now we have you and me.
Yeah.
And you're doing yoga, and I'm doing my elliptical training. So, does the structure of that meaning, and does it relate to other things that I find important? Does that structure that exists for me exist for you? And you could, a very simple way, you could do a congruence coefficients between.
Well, one thing Jewel does analytically is it begins with a population model because we don't know enough about you. And then we gradually adjust the fuel mixture, adding in more of your personal variance, in other words, a within-person model. But for some people, the population model predicts better than the individual model for a long time, 30 days or so. Other people, the personal model predicts very rapidly within 7 or 8 days. And so we adjust at an individual level the fuel mixture of population versus.
Well, that's why I said Jewel is the
personal
rule.
model.
I mean, it's the ideal way that I've ever seen of a tool that can allow you to get at idiographic development.
It's a very different way of thinking, though, for me anyway, as a population-based researcher where everything has always been a mean.
One of the amazing findings that have come out of Peter Molinar's work, but other work, by the time they're 21, monozygotic twins functionally only have shared 75% of their genotype by the time they're 21. So, well, that look, and dizygotic twins at best are 50. So all of these adoption studies or identical twins reared apart, they're meaningless. There's a wonderful book by Jay Joseph that came out in 2014, The Trouble with Twin Studies. It's controversial because he's very, very adamant about the methodological errors that we should.
Well, I think their genes are the same, but their gene expression.
Yes. Oh,
that's what's different.
Yeah, it's different methylation patterns.
Right.
I mean, Steve's work shows that. That 2013 paper. That's how I discovered him. Jen Agins gave me the challenge one day at the end of her graduate training. She said, "You keep on talking about epigenetics, but you never explain it to anybody. So could you do a little presentation for the lab?" And so I did a thing called Epigenetics 101, and I began by saying everything I know is in these PowerPoints. And when I discovered the Slavich and Cole paper, I said, this puts it all together.
Really interesting.
So obviously I love the whole content and kind of the direction that this framework's going.
Well, it's yours. It's your content.
No, but you added 7 more layers to it. Let me mention the study that we have, and then I kind of want to go to my question. So we have this real fine-grained analysis of people that are suicidal in terms of moment to moment, how they change over the course of time. And what we find is that a person who is suicidal, the average change from 1 hour to the next in their suicidal thoughts is 1 standard deviation difference from hour to hour. And so it's, we had to go over the data.
How do you analyze it? What do you use to analyze it?
So we're using M plus with some kind of something. We've got a second iteration to work with us. So we basically had to plot each individual separately and show how it operates. Now it challenges a lot of kind of thoughts about the suicide literature. So when we think about purpose in life and examining kind of using key factor analysis techniques and kind of these key factor techniques and this real inter-individual change, my question is, how do you imagine the field aggregating knowledge being as it becomes more person-centric and more idiographic?
Well, it's a challenge, right?
Mhm.
So, you're gonna hate me for this. In 1948,
No, it just makes you sound smart there, which is
No,
very well established.
Kluckhohn and Murray, Clyde Kluckhohn and Henry Murray, wrote a book about personality, and there was sexist language back then, and they said, it's always the case in personality that each man is like every other man. Each man is like only some other men, and each man is like no other man. We have nomothetic, differential, and idiographic characteristics. We all do. The challenge we have, and this is why I admire the work of Peter Molinar and John Esserow, while accepting, that truth that Kluckhohn, no one would disagree with that, right? Kluckhohn and Murray's observation. But the challenge is, how do if we start fundamentally with the idiographic, which our theory says has to be the case, and we don't want to crash jet planes anymore, so, there's a practical reason for doing that. How do we get to the differential or the nomothetic? And techniques like the idiographic filter or some of the other mathematical approaches that you see in system science methods allow us to do it. But the challenge is, we're not trained in all of those things. I certainly am not. So that means we have to collaborate. We have to go to people who, I don't know your campus that well, but do you have engineers on campus?
Yeah.
They're system scientists.
Yeah.
They may not have any interest at all in social behavioral science, but they know system science methods. They're
It's
working
funny.
with batteries or machines, but just take them out for coffee or single malt scotch and get them to think about your variables.
2 weeks ago, I was in Buenos Aires at an IEEE meeting to present Joule, and all these control system scientists were completely into this and had all of these new analyses, these analytics that would help us build on Joule.
And even though they didn't know the
nobody
variables,
in our
but they just loved the
But it doesn't
idea.
matter. No,
Yeah,
it could be a
so-
robot, could be an autonomous car.
So we have to be a little bit humble and say,
Yeah.
we have to go beyond our professional expertise. And, it's Molinar and Esserow are also mathematicians as well as being psychologists, which is fortunate. But most of us don't have that array of skills. But engineers, they do this all the time.
Yeah.
And just get them interested in your variables. They'll take it on as a problem. And
So I'm not actually thinking about that. I'm not thinking about the practicality of working with data set. I'm thinking of as imagine everyone in the room starts doing these kind of analyses, how to aggregate the findings,
Yeah.
meaning that
That's a great question.
the snowflake effect, right? Where
okay, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Pat Curran and Andrea Hussing have developed a method, and this is Psych Methods 2009, a special issue of Psych Methods 2009 called Integrated Data Analysis. At the latent level, if you have two data sets with, at the extreme, one variable is the same, you can integrate those data sets. So we just have coming out in a special section of Journal of Youth and Adolescents, we've taken 4 data sets, the 4-H study of positive youth development, 3 Templeton data sets, the YES project, the Williamson project, and I'm blocking on the 4th. And they all studied hopeful future expectations. The Boy Scout data set. The Boy Scout data set went from age 6 to 11. The young entrepreneur study went from 18 to 24, and the other 2 studies were in between. Because they had a common variable, we now have a trajectory from age 6 to age 24 from not only 4 different studies, but different people. The young entrepreneur study were kids from New England, Midwest, is Kendall still here? Midwest, right? And then California. The Boy Scout study were Cub Scouts from Philadelphia who were able to integrate it. And so now we have an integrated trajectory. I can send you the paper.
Yeah.
And it shows how to put that. So if we're all separate longitudinal studies, but we're measuring purpose
Right.
in all of us, we can put us all together. So that's another way of idiographically filtering. David.
So one thing I struggle with a lot in thinking about understanding more complex interactions between variables, and I mean that.
Could I say don't use the word interaction?
Yeah.
Coactions. Because interaction reduces it to the notion of ANOVA, which is they're separate entities. The whole idea of systems is they're integrated. We have to be careful about our language, because just like trait, interaction is a very loaded term.
Yeah, I guess I meant in the statistical sense, but coaction also implies co-causality.
Yes,
in ways that
yes. So
may or may not be warranted given on the observation. And so a huge issue that I confront routinely is the non-representativeness of the samples that we have. And increasingly that is being an issue when you think about subgroups of people. So, and this directly relates to issues in replication credits. So for instance, if you do an experiment where there are larger effects for women than men, that's the hypothesis, in a replication, a different sample of women, then you don't see the same effects. And so, shouldn't be a surprise. That should be a surprise if you assume that everyone who self-identifies as a woman always thinks always the same, which can't be true.
Yeah.
That instead, there has to be some latent variable that gender or sex was indicative of. There may or may not be the same joint distribution throughout the population in that thing, which then creates like an issue in the integrated example, right? Because there might be mean differences, but there might be all kinds of differences in the joint distributions of all kinds of observed and unobserved variables across non-representative samples. But then especially once we really want to learn from like higher order coactions, we almost never know if the sample that we have is representative of anything that we might want to make inferences about.
Yeah, so what do? And one thing we do standardly is we borrow methods from Jim Heckman and other econometricians.
I try to never borrow from Jim Heckman, but
Because he makes you pay back with interest, right? So one of the things, because we face this all the time in longitudinal studies. So what we do in our lab, we use propensity score matching, and we try to maximize the comparability of two different samples. Because in longitudinal studies, even if you had a representative sample to begin with, by time 2 you don't have a representative sample anymore because it's selective attrition.
well, but you have to believe that attrition is correlated with the variables that you care about. Right, it has to be, right, and that it is not correctable. But there's all kinds of assumptions in propensity score matching, right? That like conditional unobservables, everything else is ignorable. And there are a lot of reasons to suggest that in non-representative samples, even when you do that, then you don't get it. It's like no matter how you weight the Breitbart news poll, you're not going to represent the other news poll, even if you had the best propensity score matching and you have 10,000 people in the Breitbart poll. So, and a lot of our samples could be more like the online quick reaction polls, and even with good survey weights, they're not going to represent the population. So yeah.
I'll give Elaine, please ask the final question.
I wonder what you think about the potential for these methods in studying co-development between 2 or more individuals, as in social networks.
Yep. Well, social network analysis is one of the system science methods that I didn't talk about. I'm not an expert in, but yes.
It is, although, speaking as someone who reads this social network analysis a lot, it becomes incredibly complex when you add more than a few individuals.
Right.
And in a way, this is kind of a special case of how do you aggregate development across cases and studies, because each person in a network has a unique and separate network which may intersect. So how do you? It strikes me this huge life course principle of development that Glenn Elder developed, which is that co-development is one of the most understudied phenomena in developmental science, and
Linked lives is a key tenet
Is-
of everything we do. I
is
mean,
key.
that's why I privilege the person bidirectional relations, because of Glenn, because of the linked lives. So, there were 3 or 4 theorists that really have influenced me, but in terms of this presentation, if you see more Glenn Elder here than you see Paul Walters here, for example.
oh, yeah.
Yeah, so,
It's,
like I said, it's a challenge. I think we're going to get progress, not because we are the methodologists who will address the complexity, but because we're the developmental scientists who are asking the right questions and have the humility to go to the engineers on campus and say, I have this problem, these are not variables that you're interested in, but let me try to tell you why you should be interested in, because your kids, your family can be involved in this. So we have to keep on asking the right questions about linked lives, about plasticity, and about the opportunity through asking those complex sets of specificity questions, how we can understand what kids, in what contexts, with what experiences can lead to what positive developmental trajectories marked by purpose and a life worth living.
Thank you very much. Given the time, I just want to make a few closing remarks here. I think we may have to kind of move things out shortly. So let me be brief in my comments, but I hope the conversation continues. I'm always a bit hesitant to name anything. I don't really enjoy closing remarks because usually it's the beginning of the next conversation that we can have, and I hope that that's true. But a few things to sort of are grappling with now, I want to just sort of share a couple of these, is that among the many things that Richard pointed out, and I hope that we're all kind of processing still, and will continue to do so, I made note of the fact that he heard something in our conversation over the past couple of days that impacted him. I think he heard a lot of things that impacted him, but he pointed one out in particular. He commented on Anne's remark about the types of data that she values more, that she pays more attention to, privileges compared to others, and that made its way into Richard's remarks. And so I want to kind of sort of mirror that in a way, is that there's something that he said that made its way into what I want to share here. I heard a lot of things, but I jotted this down. He said, people with purpose are agentically shaping the world that is shaping them. That's a pretty profound idea. Really think about that you're actually acting on a world that is impacting you, and to do that is a component here of what it means to be a thriving person. And if that's true, right? If that's true, then we're not, those of us who study purpose aren't just studying purpose. And I'm saying that comment almost in response to something, an idea that Carol shared with us yesterday, that I don't think in our designing of this, I ever thought of this as a conference that's just about purpose. I mean, purpose and health. That really we're talking about a concept that we all have an interest in, we all care about, but we're looking at it from a lot of different angles and expanding it outward. In fact, I noted that in addition to the conversations on purpose, there were a lot of things that showed up on the slides that people didn't focus on. Sometimes they mentioned them, sometimes they didn't, but themselves become interesting conversations. In fact, could be their own conferences in a way. For example, I noticed this, that on more than one person's data presentation, they actually detected racial differences, right? Either in level, mean scores, or change, as we heard today, the potential for that. That we didn't make a lot of that, but that came up. And so maybe we're not just studying purpose, we're actually talking about something much bigger. And racial differences or similarities is one of those concepts where differences or similarities could actually be a really interesting thing to pursue. Some people notice context differences, right? This type of school or that type of school, or people living in this type of space versus that space, and that seemed to matter. Other people noticed even wording differences, right? People intervening on purpose and using purpose in this way. I mean, even at the level of the wording of a sentence. It's a profound idea that it mattered how you worded this sentence, whether or not it had an impact on individuals. So maybe we're not just studying purpose, right? We're actually doing a little bit more than that. And they go on. The things that are around the edges of this seem really profound to me. And a sort of a concluding remark from Richard's talk is this point. If we start with the aggregate, none of us will ever fit. another really, so I mean, even I can imagine thinking about this for a number of days and weeks out. That's a really profound idea, and if it's true, so what's next? I suspect that we all have a hunch, right? I mean, I don't have any monopoly over what we do next at all, and don't claim to. I suspect that collectively, we can think about what it is we want to do next. I tend to approach things by thinking about it as success versus failure. What would I define as success versus what would I say is failure? And for me, failure with this conference and our gathering would be if it ends here. Whatever it is you heard what you heard and you kind of go about your life and nothing changed. But success would be that the needle moved on something. I was a little bit happy to, because even throughout the past couple of days, but certainly during lunch, I heard people saying, we should talk, right? Our lab should really combine with you, or do you want to collaborate on that? I think, to me, there's already evidence of success, but and you can certainly have your own definitions of what that would look like. But for me, it's, does the needle move, either for the populations that we're working with, or our labs, or our own individual thinking about the concept of purpose? And I really hope that that's true. And just so you know, whether or not PRYDE views this as success or not is to be determined if the needle moves. And we'll be on the lookout for that. In terms of the needle moving, just 2 quick points before I close. I just want to give you a hint of what's next. I've been privileged to be a part of a couple of things surrounding purpose over the past couple of years. I mentioned Purpose 360, Conversations with Hope Lab, and a couple of other things. I've been invited to, or just showed up, even was uninvited. I showed up, people talking about purpose. And the neat thing was there's an energy around purpose, right? You say purpose, people nod their head. There's something about this term that seems really interesting to people. But probably the sadder part of it is that whatever that thing was, that event or conference kind of ends and then people go about their way, there hasn't really been a lot of continuity around this concept. I just want to share, the one thing that's really exciting to me is that we hope that this particular conference continues. So rather than the Purpose and Health Conference, we hope that this is an inaugural thing, right? We're next seeing, sort of already have some ideas about this, and so hopefully you'll receive some correspondence about this, but we're already envisioning, from a lot of the ideas we heard here today, there's a couple of conferences that just seem really intuitive. But one that we're really getting excited about is the idea of thinking about purpose in a diverse society. Right, this is the broad social changes that are going on, and that can really be identified and connected with in a lot of different ways, but I think there's a lot of stakeholders who are waiting to see how can this resource, right, actually impact how people navigate changes in society. So look for correspondence from us around that idea and what we want to do next. And also I just want to mention in terms of a product, some of you know this because where we first were with it, but as we built this conference out and we started thinking more about who was here, the translational aim of the conference, as I alluded, is core to what we do at PRYDE. And so what we're thinking about is an edited volume. Right, we're kind of putting that together now, and so in the next days probably, but certainly weeks, you will hear from us, receive correspondence with us about being involved in an edited volume where we want you to take what you presented, the ideas you're thinking about, things you're finding, and think through what are the implications of that for those for whom the consequences matter, whether it's teachers, young people, people who work with young people, parents. We heard a lot of that today. There's a lot of great scholarship emerging on purpose, but there's a space here, I think, for the translational component. What should people do with this information? What does it mean? So look for correspondence from us on that. I would be remiss. My mom would be really upset if I didn't say thank you for everything that you've done over the past couple of days. I've enjoyed every conversation, and I'm looking forward to many more. Seems a little narcissistic, but let me thank PRYDE for being here and being part of everything we've been getting us to this point, and for everyone who showed up and stuck around. We absolutely appreciate it. So, hope the conversations continue, and
thank
safe
you.
travels.
Thank you.
Can I say, I want to personally, I think we all do Nicolette because this
Absolutely.
would have been happening.
Very, very good. So that's all we have. If there's anything we can help with as you're closing up, packing up, doing whatever's next, please let us know. We'll stick around for a little bit. So please let us know. And take care.